Hi, Rob. Welcome to Athletic Skills Podcast. And today I've got Ted Munson on me. So, Ted is the lead performance nutritionist at Brentford Football Club. So, Ted, thank you very much for joining.
No, thanks for having me.
So, Ted, this is the first nutritionist actually on the podcast so far. So, just want to give a short intro about yourself and then how you managed to get to where you are now.
Yeah, so I studied sport and exercise science at Hull University, and that was I graduated in 2014. So at the time, there wasn't really nutrition in elite sport, wasn't really a thing. I think there was only a handful of nutritionists working part-time in elite football. So I actually got like a sports science internship at Hull City at the time, back in the kind of when they were back in the Prem, Steve Bruce era. And that was really good for me to see what I wanted to get into. And I saw that nutrition was like a massive gap there. So yeah, I did my MSc Sport and Exercise Science, postgraduate diploma, Sport and Exercise Nutrition at Leeds Beckett University. And that's where I really jumped into it. Moved down to London after being with Hull City for 3 years. Worked within a variety of different teams, different sports, did some work in professional cycling, worked in like the championship. So with Millwall Football Club, I was at Luton Town for a couple of years until they got promoted into the Premier League. Did 4 years at Harlequins, so rugby union. And now our main experience is that's my third season with Brentford Football Club, and also do a little bit of work in Formula One as well. So quite like broad, which I think has really helped me rather than just being like team sport. So yeah, that's how I am where I am.
And having been across different backgrounds and different teams, does the nutrition change across the different backgrounds in terms of the culture or to the coach's buy-in? So, yeah, compared to maybe where you are now.
Yeah, coach behinds are like a really interesting question. I suppose from a team perspective, like the sort of different environments here, I think I've never been anywhere that's approached nutrition in the same way. I think every single, even football team I've been with has approached it differently. Take body composition for an example. When I was worked in the rugby, it was very open about body composition and muscle mass and fat percentage, so much so there was almost like a leaderboard on the wall. That's just how they did it. Um, I would never do that now, but that's just the culture that was there. Whereas you take football, it's very much player led. I asked their permission if I want to share it even with a coach. So yeah, it is quite interesting. In terms of like coach buy-in, yeah, very different, certainly in the individual sports like cycling, and even so did some work with some professional marathon runners in athletics. I think the coach plays really big role in their nutrition, almost a lot more than in a team sport when you've got essentially 4 or 5 coaches dealing with 30 plus players. Certainly where I am now, it's very much, Ted, you're the expert. You look after that. Let us know if there's any problems. But definitely some football clubs that have a lot more of an interest than others.
You mentioned obviously that you've been working for a little while now, and so is the involvement in nutrition very much day to day now in terms of as much as involvement within the training aspects rather than just maybe on a game day or recovery?
Yeah, definitely. It's a pretty full on role. We're seeing that certainly in the Premier League, multiple nutritionists working within the first team environment. Same with the academy as well. We know that to actually set up an academy, I'm not 100% sure, but it's, if you want a category 1 level, you've got to have a lead academy nutritionist, PDP nutritionist, things like that, that's working all the way down the age groups. And now we're seeing in that first team environment, we're seeing lead nutritionist, assistant nutritionist, PhD nutritionist. I've got a PhD nutritionist myself from Cardiff University who's with us full time first team. Cameron Foster, who's absolutely excellent. He's definitely going to move on to be a lead nutritionist one day himself. Yeah, we're seeing the buy-in almost, I still think it's 5 or 6 years behind strength and conditioning, where we're seeing 3, 4, 5 S&C coaches and the specialism of rehab strength and conditioning coaches and lead S&C coaches. So I think it's getting there because we're seeing, certainly in the first team environment, every single year we're seeing a heightened importance of the physical stats, aren't we? We want to try and outrun the opposition. We want to try and be more physical. I think that puts the challenge on the academy kids coming through as well and trying to break into the first team, because technically a lot of them are excellent, but they might have a lot lower muscle mass. They might be struggling physically. So it definitely puts a little bit more emphasis on that as well. So with that, we're seeing just more and more buy-in for what we do. And what we do is certainly is a very top line, is to try and make players fitter, faster, stronger, and healthier at the same time. Sounds really easy, but it can be difficult.
You just mentioned that. So how much does nutrition then, because I haven't really thought about that in terms of the philosophy of how the coach wants to play. So like you mentioned, if you want to play a very much high intensity football, very much pressing game, how much does nutrition then have involvement within that?
Yeah, absolutely massive. I was having this conversation with in our department the other day that on a match day, if you were to take a group of elite players, top level, they could probably get themselves to the stadium themselves. They could probably drive themselves there. They could probably wash their own kit. They could probably strap themselves up, strap their ankles up. They could probably do that. I do think that some of them would struggle to eat the right sort of things at the right sort of times and get that right and have the right thing at half time. And I think that when we're thinking about how from a scientific perspective, and when we look at glycogen levels and how they can run out after 70 to 80 minutes without taking on the right sort of nutrition, that can impact physical performance massively, and we can see massive drop-offs physically. And that is sometimes the difference between being able to track back and hit certain intensities, hit certain high-speed running metrics that we want to try and do. And I think if 8 times out of 10, if you try and outrun the opposition, that's going to create more goal scoring moments. And you can do all of that work throughout the week physically in the gym, on the pitch, all the different testing. But I think if you don't eat right, you're going to struggle to get that output when it matters most. So yeah, I think a lot of people say that we're there for the kind of small percentages. I disagree a little bit. I think if you don't get your nutrition right on match day, you could have a huge drop off. Not just physically having a dodgy stomach that everybody's have when we think about cramping and hydration. I think when you really list all of that off, people think actually, yeah, makes a big difference.
So I just want to go into that you mentioned there, how important nutrition is on a game day. So just want to talk through your preparations there, having just come out of a busy period over Christmas where you maybe playing 2 or 3 games a week. Just want to talk around how you might prepare your players pre-game, then maybe during the game, and then post-game in prep for the next game, and how nutrition then plays into that.
Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about match day, I think the big day when it comes to match day is actually the day before the game. And then we see a big shift in nutrition. So generally, throughout the training week, we periodize our nutrition just like a coach periodizes training, or an S&C coach periodizes what they do in the gym. We increase carbohydrate throughout the week based on their intensity, based on their duration, and things like that. But when we get to day before a game, while we see a big drop in training load as we taper, we actually do the opposite. We increase carbohydrate intake as like a carbohydrate load. And I think that's definitely not new science. I think people have been doing that for years and years. The classic big bowl of pasta the night before a game is still a thing and it works. There's definitely a lot of more intricate parts of it, but we want to be trying to hit at least 7 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body mass on that day before a game. So it's very different for different players and different sizes. So I'm quite lucky where I am that we have a team of 9 chefs that are able to cater for the individual, as well as when they go home, just trying to help them, guide them towards the right sort of options, or actually prep food for them to take home. We increase the amount of carbohydrate snacks that are around the training ground. We give them more like carbohydrate drinks, fruit juices that we might not give them on a match day -4, -5, for example. We also increase things like nitrates. So you'll see in the classic beetroot juice day before. Yep, still a thing. We still do that. Um, so yeah, part of it is just nailing that carbohydrate intake, trying to go a little bit lower in fat and just moderate in protein. And that's what we try. That's the message we try and get across the day before a game. And for me, the aim is to start that game with your stores at capacity, because that is going to be the main energy that fuels the performance that we want to give. If we have a player starting with 50% in their tank, they're not going to be able to give it 100%, and that just makes the demands higher on a game day itself. We're going to have to fuel them more and more. So that's really important. And then after we get that match day -1 out of the way, it's about topping up fuel stores. Obviously, it depends when the game is. But let's take like a 3 p.m. kickoff. Different people do things differently. So have some players that will do more of like a larger breakfast, like a larger carbohydrate-based breakfast, so almost double the size. So they might have bagel, beans, eggs, for example, then have an additional. A couple of our guys absolutely love like 3-4 Weetabix in addition to that, and it's absolutely perfect. Doesn't need to be difficult, doesn't need to be fancy, ticks all the carbohydrate boxes. And then what they will do is taper down. So they might have a snack at 12 o'clock. Snack at 11 o'clock. Then they'll have their pre-match meal generally. about 3 to 3.5 hours beforehand, and that'll just be slightly lighter. And those players just don't want to feel too heavy going into a game, which is absolutely fine. Some players do it the complete opposite way around. They'll have just like a regular carbohydrate-based breakfast, snack, pre-match meal still 3 to 3.5 hours beforehand, but that'll be a little bit larger and it's still carbohydrate-based. Some people go for more breakfast foods. Some people go for the classic have to have pasta or a rice dish. And that's really important. Like we haven't got a bunch of robots. Everybody does things in their own way. And hopefully with our guidance, we can just guide them to the way that kind of fits them the most. Um, and when we see that when we get a new player through is I'll give them my thoughts on what they should try. And I say, look, I try this with 80% of the guys. They really like it. Give it a go. Let us know how you feel. And we can just try different ways. That's sometimes what nutrition is. It's trial and error until that player finds what works for them. So yeah, that's pre-game, but definitely nothing too fancy. Now in terms of that kind of immediately pre-game, that's where it gets a little bit, almost a little bit trickier when it comes to nutrition, because I think that there's a lot of factors that play a part. Players get nervous. They might not want foods. They might switch to more fluids to try and counteract that. But we're still trying to hit carbohydrate goals. And I try and go for between kind of the start of the warm-up and the start of the game, just trying to get 60 grams of carbohydrate on board. And to be honest, I don't really mind how the boys get that on board, as long as it works for them and it's easily digestible. So we have some players that like classic squares bars, Jaffa cakes, absolutely great. They've been using that for years and years. And we have some boys that just, it works for them. They like the taste of it, goes down easy, great. We have some players that go a little bit more technical and they'll have certain carbohydrate energy gels, Lucozades, things like that. Things that are designed to be easier on the gut. And again, a lot of them have been using it for years as well. And for those of them that kind of don't like either, then we start to look at different ways to get carbohydrate. Like how can we be a little bit fancy? How can we look in the endurance world of how they take on carbohydrates? So a lot of them using concentrated carbohydrate drinks where 500 ml will give you 80 grams of carbohydrate. How can we use that and take that into the football world of taking like a shot of carbohydrate drink? Doesn't feel like 20 grams of carbohydrate, it just feels like a Lucozade or something like that. But a little bit fancy with some players that struggle with it, but they're the targets we try and get. And again, half time is very similar to pre-game. It's about refueling, rehydrating up to, I always aim for that kind of 40 to 50 grams of carbohydrate. Any more that they can tolerate is definitely a plus, but it needs to be based on how they feel. And I try and push them to not think about how they feel at the time at halftime. It's about how they're going to feel at 80 minutes. And that's what I say to them when a player says, I'm not hungry, I feel great, I'm running great. It's okay, how are you going to feel at 80 minutes? Then they're like, okay, but I'm probably going to be tired. Okay, what do I need? Okay, energy gel, half a Lucozade, half a banana, perfect. But definitely, I think as I'm a full-time nutritionist, it's easier to try and individualize that. And now I could pretty much tell you what every single player does at halftime. I get it ready for them. It's in their place. I'll go around, give them a quick reminder. I know who has what at what time. And I think that's peace of mind for me, for the coaches. They're taking on energy on board that they're going to use to try and get the physical outputs that the coaches want them to get.
You just mentioned there how important it is to individualize for a player. Let's say you've got a squad of, on their match day with 20, 21 players. You're not going to give everyone the same meal before games because people might do things differently. So, yeah, so how important is it to individualize players, firstly for their buy-in, but also to get the best outcomes on the pitch?
Yeah, like individualization is everything. We've got a squad of different body types. Like it's crazy and different things work with different people. And I think it's important that we present to the players that kind of ideal. And I think that's something that I think a lot of graduates struggle with after university going into elite sport is that you're told this is the way to do it. Yeah, I think if you actually look at the literature around carbohydrate loading, it's 10 to 12 grams of carb per kilo of body mass. When you've got a 90-kilo player, like good luck taking on a kilo of carbohydrate. That's a lot. And I think, well, bear in mind, I know some players that can do that. I know some 90 plus kilo players that would never do that. And that would just literally make them feel so full. So in that literature and trying to apply it to an individual, trial and error, this worked, this didn't work. How can we bend those rules a little bit so we find that sweet spot for the player? And I think sometimes they're pretty bad at just asking the players for feedback. So how did you feel there? Sometimes you go like straight for the numbers, or or straight for, yeah, they cramped 85 minutes. Oh no, it's a nightmare with their nutrition. There's so many different factors. Individualization is definitely key. I've never been with any team that have just used the same thing. I think if it was very generic, we probably wouldn't have a job. So yeah, no, it's definitely important. We've got players that are so bought in on the individualization that they're buying into having private chefs now. Majority of Premier League players, I'd say at least a third of Premier League players have some sort of private chef now because they're buying into that individualization so much, which I think is great. And it's definitely that individualized nutrition is where we want to go. Certainly me, as a nutritionist, that's what I want to do. I don't want to work with a group of people. I want to work with, yeah, we have group, we have guidelines, but there's lots of individuals in that group.
So one of the questions you just mentioned there, and I want to touch around how you manage players outside of your environment. And you mentioned how the use of private chefs, which is great, but then how does that conflict in terms of, if they've got a private chef, will they maybe take over in terms of, or have different values in terms of what you're asking the player to do? Or how do you manage that as well as forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, it comes down to the individual. Like, I think we've got 3 or 4 different types of player. I think at the bottom, not the bottom, but I think we have an educated player that likes to cook, and I think that's, to me, is the dream, because I think you've got either they've got a partner that cooks for them, or they're really interested in it, and I think that's, yeah, where I want to go. I work with a lot of Scandinavian players, and I did some work with Denmark for the last year, so I was out with those guys, and I find that the Scandinavian players so educated around cooking, probably a whole lot better than me, and they're like, honestly, I can leave them to it. Just you give them some guidelines, they'll ask for some help, or what sort of meal should I have here? They're going away, they're cooking it themselves. Take a little picture, and I'm like, that's very impressive, really good. You got those guys that are really educated, love cooking. How many, that distribution in that team is different. We've got quite a few at Brentford. You have the player that likes to meal prep, or purchase in a meal prep, or even meal prep themselves, or the club will meal prep for them. I think they quite like the flexibility of that. Sometimes they might want to go out to eat. Sometimes they might want to cook themselves or grab something from the fridge that's been personalized to them. Um, there's that. And then I think there is, yeah, the kind of the private chef, which a lot of teams have at least 10 plus players on that. Not necessarily, just because they have a private chef doesn't necessarily mean that they're like uneducated around it. They might just see the importance of it. Like, I can think of a couple here that are very good cooks, very well educated around it. They just see it as, I know I need this. I know this is important to me. And we go from there. So that's, for me, is like the 3 strands of players. If I was to get like a relatively young player that's uneducated a little bit, I see that. I think some clubs would like maybe push them to get a private chef straight away. A little bit different. I think using like meal prep services are really good. So Hello Chef and Gusto, not Hello Chef. No, is it Hello Chef? What is it? Hello Fresh. Hello God. I looked at that person. Yes, like HelloFresh, Gusto. Um, they actually teach you how to cook. They send everything through in a box, and they almost teach you. So I always push that onto the guys. Be like, "Oh, give this a go for 2 weeks. I guarantee you'll love it, and you'll learn a little bit. Then you can cancel it after 4 weeks, and you've actually got all the meal cards up for you, and you're ready to go. Um, or they might want to. I push them towards a little meal prep, keep that flexible. So I always use that middle ground as my kind of go-to when we get a new player in. And then if they want to get themselves a private chef, great. We've got some good connections for that. So yeah, like, you deal with those 3 very differently. So with the chefs, the guys that have chefs, it would be, I just speak to the chef. So if we've done bloods on a guy and his CRP is really high, a little bit kind of inflammation in there, and I'll speak to the chef, can we get some more omega-3 in his meal tonight off the next couple of days? How can we use nutrition to combat that inflammation? A little bit harder for the guys that are not even for cooking themselves, but on the meal preps. How can we speak to them? How can we tailor what they're ordering in? So yeah, like, very different for different players. Like, I wish if everyone had a chef, it would be fantastic. Like, I really like working with the private chefs, and you really see the benefit of it really quickly. Boys come in the next day and like, I really like that. Can you keep that comms up? So it's good.
And one last question on preparation around classic thing in football around changing kickoff times. You might have a 12:30 kickoff versus an 8 p.m. kickoff, and nutrition each day or each of those game days will look massively different, I imagine. So you hear the classic thing where someone's having pasta at 8 o'clock in the morning for breakfast, for example, for an early kickoff. So how do you manage players in terms of if they have a specific routine prior to a game, or how do you manage maybe the longer periods throughout the day to making sure they're fueled for that late kickoff?
Yeah. I usually send around like a little document. They're basically just a little infographic that I've put towards it. It was like how, if I were them, how I would structure that day, especially when they're like having meals at home. So if it's, say if it's like a home game, late kickoff, probably going to report for pre-match meal. So which could be say if it's an 8 p.m, you're going to be looking at 4:30. They probably report. Now there's probably 3 meals before then. They're probably going to have breakfast, snack, lunch, then report the pre-match meal. So definitely for that, I try and give them a little bit more information of how I go. Probably like 3 different options. So those who like to have a larger breakfast and then taper down, those like to go the other way, and just say, here's some guidelines. And I always message me if you've got any questions. And I probably always get like 4 or 5 people that just want to check, usually the younger players rather than the players that are more senior, have done it for years. If it's like an early kickoff, which is interesting, if it's like a 12:30, you're reporting at 9 a.m. for pre-match meal. I always say that pre-match meal should never be your first meal of the day. So sometimes like send the guys home with even just a small kind of protein smoothie and just say, look, when you're setting your alarm for 8 o'clock, that's the first thing you get on board. Kickstart the metabolism, get going, and then you're reporting for pre-match an hour and a half later. In terms of what they choose, yeah, you've definitely got some players that 3 hours pre-game have to have the same thing, whether that be pasta, rice dish, because they know it sits well in their stomach and they're very much like a little bit OCD with it. For me, if I'm ever like speaking to a player for the first time, try and push them towards breakfasty foods, because again, that's the sort of food that's going to be fueling us for the day. It sits well in the stomach. It's balanced. It's usually carbohydrate based. So certainly seeing, based on that advice, a lot of people having bagels, avocado, toast, cereals, whether it be an early kickoff or a late kickoff. But again, it's very different. At the end of the day, it's one of those things, as long as they're getting a good carbohydrate-based meal, low in fat, moderate in protein, I don't really care if it's pasta, rice, or cornflakes. It wouldn't really matter to me.
So that's pre-game. So let's talk about post-game. So imagine in a busy period, maybe you've got a game in 3 days' time. So how important is nutrition then after a game in terms of getting ready for what's coming next?
Yeah. So post game, I'd usually say, again, this kind of, it will constantly come back to the individual, but there's some players that would want to get like a carbohydrate protein shake on as soon as possible and try and prioritize that liquid carbohydrate and protein, simply because high intensity exercise suppresses appetite. It's very normal. You're working at 80-90% intensity, your blood is going to your muscles, it's not in your gut, you don't feel hungry. So we try and push that kind of liquid protein on as much as possible, as soon as possible, as soon as they get off. Whereas there are some players that are absolutely starving after a game, and within 10-15 minutes, they're straight in and they're consuming a meal. And then they might actually have that protein shake when they go home an hour and a half later. To me, there's no right or wrong way of doing it, as long as they're taking on regular feeding. Now, if we've got a 7-day turnaround, so say it's a Saturday, we usually put on a little bit more treat meals. Absolutely no issues with like good quality sourdough pizza, sort of low cheese. It's actually a really good way of replenishing carbohydrate stores. Healthy burgers, wedges, all sorts, from nice like steak wraps. We make it like a treat. It's definitely not like what you would see as like healthy on paper, because we want to try and promote refueling. And I think there's a really healthy way of doing it, and then there's something the boys are going to enjoy and potentially get a little bit more out of. So yeah, 10-15% of it might be added sauces or tiny little bit of kind of pan fried food. But really, I think the benefits of the quantity outweigh that. So yeah, for a 7-day turnaround, might be a little bit slightly more unhealthy. For a tight turnaround, so if we've got 3 games in a week, it's really different. If we would go too high fat, then we could potentially mess up digestion a little bit. So we want to try and get more kind of pastas, like I say, like the sourdough breads, we might go a little bit more just carbohydrate based and less kind of fat based if it was a tight turnaround. So for example, the tighter turnaround would go for more like pasta pots. We'd have an abundance of kind of fruit. We'd maybe have some like really nice carbohydrate based cake slices as dessert rather than putting like a brownie on for the guys if it was a 7-day turnaround. So you do see like a noticeable difference because we're basically going straight into a refuel. And that's a carbohydrate based refuel because we've got a game 48 to 72 hours later. Um, but yeah, it is a little bit different.
And then you mentioned around a lot on carbs there, but how important is protein as well on top of that in terms of your recovery?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, in terms of recovering to play sport, um, carbohydrate is definitely the number one thing to get right. Now, when it comes down to protein, we're talking about rebuilding muscle tissue. Is that obviously really important when we exercise? We're tearing up our muscles basically. If we don't get our protein, we could potentially delay that soreness a little bit, and we might not be certainly for a young athlete we don't get that protein on, we might be damaging adaptations, which is what we want to do. We want to play a sport. We want to adapt to what we're doing. And that's what protein helps us do. So definitely trying to get 20 to 30 grams of protein on within an hour of finishing, ideally earlier, 30 minutes is definitely key. Can be done through food, can be done through a protein shake, whatever works for that individual. If you're not hungry, go for a shake. If you're hungry, go for food. If you're traveling and things like that, that adds a lot of kind of complexity to it, especially as like a young athlete, not in a professional club. That meal prep is very key. So that's where like shakes and things are absolutely great because it doesn't really require refrigeration or anything like that. And you still get the nutrients, the protein, the carbohydrates that you need. So yeah, and then after that kind of post-match meal, you got to think of how to optimize recovery. And for me, it's taking on food little and often, and protein definitely plays like a key part of that. Whether in the elite environment, we sort them for a shake, we sort them for their post-match meal. A lot of the guys will just box up something small to have when they get back home. Or they might take like a protein bar home with them to have before they go to sleep, just to give them that extra little 20, 30 grams of protein so they can hopefully wake up in the morning feeling better, ready to do their recovery session and go again.
So I just want to move on to a bit more of a generalized topic in terms of recording intake. So one of the questions for when I chat to coaches around how you maybe manage recording players' intake. So is that something that you do, or do you get the players to do it themselves? And have you got any advice for maybe coaches that are working with players, maybe not have the access to resources that you have, but
Yeah.
how they maybe start to manage that sort of process?
Yeah, interesting one. So I think we do manage intake. So I'm a massive fan of a food diary. I don't think that you can get a better intake into a player's lifestyle, what they're doing outside. A huge fan of a food diary when it's done correctly. And I think the issue is that a lot of certainly young athletes will not tell the truth on a food diary. And generally what I look for if I was to say sit down to play for the first time, I might take that food diary for them as a really easy way of doing it. Where if we've got a player that's a little bit more switched on and more motivated, I might send them away with a food diary and actually ask them to take some snaps and pictures of their meals and snacks as well to send through to cut with their food diary. So that to me is the easiest way to do it. And then you could potentially take that food diary and then match it against their training that they're doing. So I might ask for a food diary of a day off where they're not exercising, might ask for a moderate to tough training day, and then I might ask for like a match day. What you want to be seeing is that the higher intensity, the more carbohydrates. Protein should be relatively consistent throughout, looking for that kind of 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilo of body mass if you're looking on to build. And then fat should be relatively stable throughout as well, around about that kind of 1 gram of fat per kilo of body mass. So a little bit higher in gainers and younger athletes. So yeah, that's what you want to be looking for. And that's how I'd measure it. Simple food diary. You can use free apps like MyFitnessPal. I still think is great. I still use it now if I just want to quickly do something and quickly just think, okay, is that meal good? I can set it to some guidelines if I want to. If an athlete has it, they can share it with you as well. So I think that's a really easy way of doing it. If you were at a club and looking to take that to the next level, I think the technology is getting much better. There are now apps that you can take a picture of your meal and it will sort of guesstimate exactly what is in that meal, macronutrient wise. I think that's where we're going to get to in the next couple of years. And the accuracy is like scarily good. I think there are apps like Hexis that is really good as an education tool where you can track what you're eating, but get some feedback around it as well. Especially when you're a coach dealing with a number of players, it can be really tough. Um, so yeah, I think it depends on the kind of resource that you have. But certainly if you were like an IDP coach and you had 10 players, I definitely think it's worth doing because we're going to see gains around it. That if someone isn't getting their nutrition, a young player isn't getting their nutrition right, and we're asking them to grow and physically, nutrition should be almost top of the agenda alongside their strength and conditioning.
So alongside recording your intake, I imagine you'll be doing a lot of education, maybe with you players that you just brought into the club or younger players that come through. So what sort of strategies do you use to maybe educate these players in terms of the nutrition side or nutrition messages that you're giving the players? Then also they can then manage themselves when they're away from you as well.
Yeah, I think so. I still have like an education program that I'll do at any club. It depends on what the buy-in at the club is. I'm really lucky here. I can get in front of the first team players once a week if I wanted to, and the buy-in is there to allow that, and they'll make time for that. But it depends where you are. So I think having an education program is important, and that could be at the start of the season. You might do like a session on preseason itself. Like, here's how we're going to structure our nutrition to get ourselves in that place. You might have players that have come back in really good shape, players that might have increased their skin folds a little bit. How are you going to educate around that? Then you might go on to match day performance. So you might do an education session on that. And this is group education to start with. Then you might go into the winter months. You might do something on health and being into congested fixtures. That's almost its own education session around recovery. So I think you can do the basic general squad wise education, but then you might have a group of individuals in that. So you might have players that are working on individual goals. So it could be body composition. It could be that they're trying to increase muscle mass, reduce body fat. So they might have their own little education program. You might have a group of players that you think that in 3 or 4 years' time, they're going to be worth X amount of million quid, or you want to sell them to a big team who's going to make a load of money for the club. They might get a little bit extra attention because they're seen as that's the future of the club. So they might have their own little education. But to be honest, I take advice from our sports psychologist, a guy called Michael Caulfield. The amount of education that you can get across in little doses of just conversation outweighs any presentation you could possibly do. And I've definitely like thought about that a lot more. Of just, for me, we have a really nice little coffee station. I just hang around there a little bit and just have conversations, and the amount of kind of little kind of nuggets that I can drop on with the guys there is honestly, I think it's invaluable. And I think sometimes we get a little bit focused on, I've got to deliver X presentation at this time and it needs to be about this. Sometimes just a conversation with a group of players around a coffee, you can get so much more. And you actually get a lot more feedback as well, rather than players just stood there nodding their head, might not be listening. That's really important. Obviously, it's being present for meal times as well. Like, I'm not the sort of nutritionist to stand there at the kind of live station and just be like watching what's on their plate. I'll just go and sit down with them, have a chat with them, maybe a little bit of banter, something like that. And I think that's where the education is done, in those informal settings. But also using other people to do your education for you. So our head chef, Liam Leach, is unreal, not just from a chef perspective, but like he knows the players' goals, uh, nutritional goals, whether that be health related based on their blood tests, whether it's based on their body composition, like where we see them. He could literally personalize everything. So a lot of the times he's pointing the players in the right direction based on their goals that I've set them. He's just a reinforcer for that. And he's the head chef, like unbelievable chef, can cook, you can make anything taste great. Like, boys absolutely love him. So actually it's just like using those other people to get your message and education across as well. Like, that's so important.
Through conversations, and I imagine is really positive for nutritionists, especially that building your trust with the players and just showing you care when you have a conversation with them whilst they're eating or by the coffee station or whatever. So rather than you just being nutritionist and you're set for them by a screen.
Yeah, you got to
So
pick your
that trust
time.
element is massive.
Yeah, you got to pick your time to get it across.
Just means you have 20 coffees a day when you're trying to have a
Oh, no.
conversation with
Wired all the time. Yeah.
them. So to finish up on, I want to chat maybe a couple of myths that are out there around nutrition, maybe across maybe some sports coaches or PE teaching something. So one I've always seen is around coaches advising players, or maybe them doing it themselves in their own nutrition, is around, and you've probably seen it the same maybe and in the general population around cutting out carbohydrates completely if you want to get
Yeah.
fitter. And as we've just mentioned, you don't need to explain it again, but you just mentioned the importance of carbohydrates in performance, but also from a health point of view as well.
Oh, that's very,
So
very common. Like still this all the time. And it usually comes down to body composition, is that a player might feel like they're too heavy or think that they need to cut out carbohydrates because they want to drop body fat. But yeah, which is a huge myth. And the issue about it is that when we consume carbohydrates and when we store carbohydrates as glycogen and muscles and liver, we also store water with that. Now, that can obviously make us heavier on the scale. Now, when we cut out those carbohydrates, you're obviously losing stored water. So yeah, you can drop weight really quickly, but it's that weight is nothing to do with muscle or fat. It's just pure stored water. So I think that's where the misconception comes from. And there are definitely, I think the issue when it comes with, certainly from my experience over the years with coaches, is that I think a lot of coaches are ex-players and they have tried something that's worked for them. And I think they think that, certainly some coaches I've worked with think that's how all their players should be. And you see it, you read about it now of managers that come in and we're banning all sauces in the canteen. It's not healthy. That's what I used to do when I was a player. That's what I used to have. This is what we need to have. And it's poor practice because everybody does things differently. And while there might be some good practice in there, like coaches need to understand that you've got a team, but you've got a group of individuals that do things differently. And I think it's understand that it's trusting the people that you have and that you've employed, nutritionists, S&C, whoever's getting that message across to go there. So I think that's definitely been an issue alongside with, the classic, cut out carbohydrates, when actually the only way to drop body fat is to reduce overall calorie intake. But it can be really tough when you're trying to manage body composition alongside increasing physical performance. Because if you get somebody in a calorie deficit, their physical outputs will drop. They're going to be more fatigued because they've not got stored energy or enough energy to give them that. So it's finding the right times for it. When it comes to body composition, but certainly going to play a cut out carbohydrates, it's going to make you lighter. It's going to drop body fat. It's not the case.
have you got any advice for a coach who maybe wants to advise their players on how they maybe should turn up to training, let's say for a 2-hour football session on an evening? What maybe should they bring to making sure they're fueled for that training session, and maybe for after the session that we should have straight away after?
Yeah, first, I think it's something that's not always done is actually communicating to the players around the intensity of the session, and it actually will put the ball in their court a little bit. It's not necessarily saying, you should bring X. It's actually saying, guys, it's going to be a 2-hour session tonight. It's going to simulate what you do in a game. It's going to be hard. Let's try and use that to practice how you fuel around games. Because that's what you've got to do. You've got to practice and training that works on game day. And if people don't fuel around training at all throughout the week and then go into a game day, try and smash 2 gels, Lucozade, that's when people get stomach issues. So yeah, if I was a coach, I'd be like, okay, message on the WhatsApp group, 2-hour session tonight. Recommend that you have a meal 3 hours before like you do on game day. Could be a good idea to bring a banana and a Lucozade. Whereas if it's a light session, say if it's a 45-minute light session working on shape, for example, they could be like, guys, easy session tonight. Not necessarily easy session, but it's going to be a shape-based, low physical session. Recommend just bringing water, maybe bring a shake for afterwards if you've got a bit of travel. So that, I think, communication is unbelievable coaching, because it's not just thinking about what they're doing in the session. It's actually going to help them perform in that session, whether it's for those tough sessions, but then if it's not a tough session, it's going to make sure that they're not having anything they don't need. And that's going to help them physically moving forward. And We should be coaches. They periodize training. They've got to understand that you've also got to periodize a lot of other things around that training to get the most out of training.
And I like that. And I really thought about that to us around giving them, and plus giving them ownership there. It makes it feel like it's their choice in terms of what they're bringing, which creates more buy-in as well.
And there's so much free resource out there, like good resource as well. But there's also some really bad resources. So for me, if you have a young player that wants to try and get a plan together and they don't know where to go, they're probably going straight on Instagram. And they're probably going to Google nutrition for football, and they end up finding a PT who is not qualified in nutrition. And there might be some weird stuff that's on there. They might put stuff on their Instagram of them working with athletes and this stuff's weird and wonderful. We've seen it all. But just try and find a nutritionist who is on the sport and exercise nutrition register. That's the kind of minimum standards, certainly in the UK. And they've basically proved that they've gone to university, they've got an MSc, they are actually qualified to do and call themselves a performance nutritionist. When, it's not a protected title, pretty much anyone could call themselves a nutritional therapist or anything like that. So it's just being stringent on who you're getting your information from. Check their background, go on the British Dietetics Association website. You can search for a performance nutritionist near you to contact, get a plan together. And I think it's money well spent. You're going to learn about how you can fuel for what you do.
No, that's great advice. And I feel like we've really just touched on dipped our toe in nutrition there. So I feel there's a lot more we could chat around this. Thanks, Ted, for joining. Is there any way if anyone's got any more questions around some of the stuff you spoke around or anything around nutrition that can get in touch with you?
Yeah, probably like Instagram is what I'm on, Instagram and LinkedIn. So LinkedIn would be Ted Munson, and on Instagram it's tedmunson.nutrition. And they're the best ones. So yeah.
That's great. And I'll link those in the show notes as well. But Ted, thank you very much for your time. I know you're with a busy schedule working football, so I appreciate you coming to chat with us.
That was good. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Athletic Skills Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it helpful in learning more about impacting your youth athletes' movement and physical development. If you did enjoy this episode, please take a moment to give us a subscribe and share to any other coaches or teachers that you think it may help. Also, if you have any feedback or topics that you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or on the email in the description. And we'd be more than happy to try and tackle those challenges you are facing as a sports coach or a PE teacher. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. I look forward to speaking to you soon.